It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Steve Raphael. Steve is Professor of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. His research over the years has focused on the economics of low-wage markets, housing, and what I've come to know him for, research on the economics of crime and correction. I first came across Steve's work when I read his book co-edited with Michael Stoll called Do Prisons Make Us Safer?, which is absolutely mandatory reading for anybody in the Treasury Department. Is there anybody from Treasury here? Go on. That's what I like to see. Good. You need to read his book. That book, I can tell you, is an absolutely superb analysis of the causes and consequences of the US prison build-up. Now, Steve is going to tell you that the Australian imprisonment rate is nowhere near that of the US, and he's absolutely right. But the fact is that our imprisonment rate in Australia is at a record high, and it's growing rapidly. Over the last 2 years, for example, it's grown by 24%. It's reasonable to ask whether we could stabilise or even reduce our imprisonment rate without jeopardising public safety. And this is an important issue. Some of Steve's most recent work addressed this question head on, and I can tell you it makes for riveting reading if you don't mind the odd equation or two. We in the Bureau love them. You know, I think it was Stephen Hawking who said that every equation in a book halves its readership. But I can tell you, Steve, in the Bureau it doubles the readership. So I'd like you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Steve Raphael. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Good morning, and I want to thank the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics Research and Griffith University for inviting me. This is really a treat for me to come across the country and learn from you guys and share what I've been doing, and also to visit this absolutely beautiful city. The topic of my talk today is going to focus on recent reforms in California sentencing that have drastically impacted our incarceration rate. And what I want to do is walk you through a little bit of context in terms of what's happening in the United States in general in terms of correction policy and incarceration rates, and where California sits in that, sits relative to the national trend. And then I want to talk specifically about California, because California, to some degree, while to some degree forced by federal court order, but also driven by popular sentiment, is kind of at the cutting edge of correction reforms in the state. As probably many of you know, the United States system is actually quite unique in the sense that we don't really have a prison system. We have 51 prison systems. We have one for every state, and then we have a federal system. And they're quite autonomous from one another, although they do tend to move in conjunction because to some degree policy sort of trends permeate through professional organizations and so on and so forth. So we have gotten out front of the curve in the sense of reducing our incarceration. And what I want to do is walk through how it's happened in California. And then more importantly, I want to spend some time talking about some of the public safety implications in terms of the impacts of the changes that have happened in California for crime rates. And then if we have time, I'd like to spend a little bit of time musing about why we saw the effects we saw, or more precisely why we observe not so much of a crime effect in California, and maybe that'll be useful for thinking about correctional placement and prison sentence in general from a very utilitarian point of view as a crime control device relative to other types of interventions, which will be the focus of the other keynote speeches and a lot of the papers that are presented here today. So just to give you a little bit of background, the United States, we actually have, which is somewhat unique to us, oftentimes when we refer to our prison population, we're referring to people who have been sentenced for a felony crime for a year or more, for a correctional stay of a year or more. But we also have a large pretrial population that sits in jails that are run by counties. There's about 3,000 counties in the United States, and the counties are subsumed or nested within states. So if you look at our incarceration rate over time, basically, we used to be Australia, right? So we'd be 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. If you look during Prohibition, there was an increase in incarceration rate associated with the crime associated with Prohibition. It was relatively stable until about 1975, and then our incarceration rate took off quite rapidly, starting in about 1975 through 2010 or so. If you add jail inmates to our prison population, at a peak we had an incarceration rate of over 700 per 100,000, and now we're down to about 666 per 100,000, largely because of what's happened in California in recent years. So the United States has gone through a prison boom. There's been enormous political outcry in recent years to try to change this. And for the most part, not only among people who are advocating for those who are disproportionately impacted, but also among criminal justice professionals who are generally looking for other ways to sort of organize the world. So we might ask, so what happened? Why did this happen? And so we can think of any population that is sort of dynamic in the sense people are coming in and people are leaving. What determines that size of the population are two things, right? The rate at which you admit people and how long they're going to stay there. And if we think of the rate of admission, that could be associated with the crime rate, the rate at which we catch people that commit crime, the rate at which we convict people that we catch, and the rate at which we admit people that we convict to prison. So we can think of all of these different things that contribute to prison admissions. And then, of course, time served, or how much time people are there, it's going to depend on the sentence they receive at the front end, right? So how much time they're going to do. And then, of course, in many prison systems across the world, it's also going to be determined by what is the release policy, or essentially the policy governing parole or early release. And all these things have changed in the United States. For the most part, if we look at what happened to admissions, I have a little thing. So what this graph is doing here is just showing the admissions rate in 1984 and 2009. It's annual prison admissions per 100,000 by the controlling offense, so the most serious offense generating the admission to prison. And what you see is that for the most serious crimes, right, the serious violent crimes, there actually isn't a big increase in admissions, with the exception of aggravated assault. It should be noted that over this period, crime is actually declining quite a bit, so the fact that the admissions rate stays the same and increases quite a bit for aggravated assault suggests that, that sentencing has gotten more severe. But what we do see is for less serious crimes like larceny, fraud, there's a big increase in admissions rates. For drug offenses, it goes from 9 per 100,000 to 47 per 100,000. And these other offenses are lesser felonies. Then we have a big increase in admissions for people who are on parole. In other words, have been released from prison once before and they're being returned for a violation. Not necessarily with a new case, but for violating the terms of their conditional release. So part of the story of what happened in the U.S. is that we've had a big increase in the rate at which we admit people. But another big part of the story is for people who committed relatively serious crimes, there's been a very big increase in the expected amount of time that people are going to serve. And essentially these two things in conjunction, the increase in prison admissions for relatively less serious offenses in conjunction with a very large increase in the amount of time people can expect to serve, has basically driven that big increase in U.S. incarceration rates. Almost none of it has to do with actual behavior in the sense that there wasn't a big change in crime. In fact, crime was declining over this time period. And if you were to somehow back out the effect of the big increase in incarceration on crime, it still suggests crime didn't have much to do with it. And thus, much of what's going on in the U.S. is that we just have become very tough in terms of our sentencing policy. We use prisons more extensively. So there are people now that we send to prison that in the past we wouldn't have sent to prison. And when we send them there, we send them there for longer, right? And that basically explains what happened. So, and then I have this one graph showing the U.S. and Australia just because I couldn't resist, right? So here's us and here's you guys, right? So we're a lot higher. Now what's going on in California? So California, the largest state in the country, right? About 40 million, almost 40 million people. Our incarceration rate, and this is just prisons alone, basically looks like the United States up until recent times, and then it falls drastically. And so what I want to do is walk you through essentially why we were much like the nation and what happens here, right? This is going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I want to point out one other thing about California that's sort of very unique. So this particular graph is showing the total inmate population in the state. That's the blue line. The red line is the total number of inmates in a state prison, because sometimes inmates will be in a local county jail because they'll contract beds with the local county jail, or increasingly in the states, some states will contract with other states to take some of their inmates, right? And that explains this difference. The green line here is our rated capacity, right? And despite the fact that at the peak we had something like 170,000 inmates in California prisons, we never had capacity over 83,000, right? So there were many years where literally we had over 200% of the rated capacity of prisoners in jails. And that's been a long-term problem. Even when our incarceration rate was much lower, our prisons have always been crowded, and it's created all sorts of issues. And in fact, it's what prompted much of the reforms that we're going to talk about today. So just a little bit of history of how this prison overcrowding fits into litigation history or into the reforms that we're going to talk about today. So there are actually two cases in the United States that were brought on behalf of prison inmates that were filed in federal court. One was Coleman v. Brown. Now it's v. Brown because Brown's the governor. And the other is Plata v. Brown. And they both essentially alleged that the state prison system was in violation of the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And the argument was that the overcrowding in prisons and jails was resulting in inadequate mental health and medical care for inmates in the system. Two federal courts agreed. The two cases were combined to be sort of managed by a three-judge court in 2006, and it put the state of California in this bind of constantly being under threat that a federal judge was going to order that prisoners be released en masse to be brought into compliance with the findings in these two particular courts. It all kind of came to a head in 2009 when the three-judge court basically ordered the state that they had to reduce the prison population to 137% of design capacity, either by building a lot more prisons, right, or by passing sentencing reform to reduce the prison population. And if the state didn't do it, the court would. At the time, our current governor in California was the Attorney General, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 2011, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and basically put the state on notice that you have to reduce the prison population immediately, or the federal government was going to take over the population and release the number of people it needed to bring the system in compliance. And that prompted a series of reforms, some by the state legislature and some brought in by popular referendum, that are going to drive the big declines that we're going to see. So I'll just talk a little bit about what these reforms are. Some relatively quickly in passing, and then others we'll need to spend more time on. So first, there was an assembly bill in 2009 that was passed that tried to incentivize counties to minimize the degree to which they revoke people on probation. And the basic idea was, we have this odd structure in the United States where county agents, right, basically prosecutors, DAs, county probation, make decisions that send people up to state prison. And oftentimes the counties, if they keep the person local, put the person on probation, have some sort of community correction, give them a jail sentence, the counties pay that bill. If they send them to state prison, the state pays that bill. And so there's this built-in fiscal incentive to send people to state prison. So one of the things that the state had done is they passed Assembly Bill 678, which is essentially an attempt to incentivize probation departments to sort of get better outcomes in terms of their probation caseload. So if they lowered the probation revocation rate below the historical level, then some of the money that was saved in terms of less people in prison was then shared back with the county probation departments. That was the first reform. Had a modest effect on corrections. The second reform was correction realignment, which is a bigger one, which we're going to talk about in detail in just a second. And then we also had two voter initiatives that are, we have direct democracy in California where voters can actually pass initiatives that are amendments to our state constitution that then have to be implemented. One was passed in 2012, and basically it was a proposition to scale back our three strikes law. So it used to be the case that if you had two serious or violent felony offenses and you caught a third felony offense, any kind of felony offense, you got a 25-year to life sentence. So, there are cases of someone stealing a piece of pizza or a couple of CDs at a store or doing something relatively minor and then getting a life sentence, and it meaning a life sentence. They would go 25 years to life with no chance of parole until they did those 25 years. That was scaled back by the voters, and then Prop 47 basically changed a whole bunch of crimes that could be charged either as a felony or a misdemeanor to a misdemeanor crime, and they're going to have big impacts. So we'll talk about those in kind. But let's talk about realignment first, because that's going to be a big one. So what did realignment do? So again, this was the state's response to the Supreme Court's ruling. And what Assembly Bill 109, or California Realignment, passed and implemented in October of 2011 did was basically it identified a group of offenders that are called non-sexual, non-violent, non-serious offenders, or people call them triple nons, right? And what happens with the triple nons is if you're a triple non in prison, and when you're released to prison, instead of being on parole and being subject to revocation, being sent back to state prison, now you're going to be monitored by county probation, and they have to come up with some other way to punish you other than sending you back to state prison. And oftentimes that might mean a short jail spell, it might mean some other sort of non-correction sanction, but it pulled off the table the use of prison for those people once they've been released from prison. And then, of course, for people who do not have a history of serious or violent crimes, who are convicted for a triple non-offense, now they have to serve their time in a county jail, okay, rather than a state prison. So it basically restricted what prosecutors and what counties can do in terms of sending people to prisons. And what happened? Well, basically, what this graph is showing us is weekly admissions to the state prison system in California. Here's where realignment goes into effect. And you can see that almost immediately, our weekly prison admissions in the system dropped from about 2,200 people a week to about 600 people per week, right? It happens literally overnight. And the other thing that happens is that if we look at releases from prison were balanced with admissions, right? The system was roughly in steady state at about 2,300. And then it starts to decline too, but at a much slower rate, right? So here's admissions, here's releases. And since admissions goes like this, and releases goes at a slower rate, in the meantime, admissions fall short of releases and the prison population shrinks. Now, what's driving this is that in California, we had this policy of revoking people. Something like 60 or 70% of the people that released from prison were being revoked back to prison over the next year or two, actually 2 or 3 years for the 60% figure, and they were doing very short periods of time, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and then they'd get out, and then they'd be revoked again, and then they'd get out and be revoked again. And sometimes they had actually committed felony crimes, and the DAs were basically kind of fast-tracking them back into prison without prosecuting them again. But a lot of times they were being revoked for things that were, missing an appointment or testing positive for drugs or things that weren't necessarily felony crimes. And so it was almost like we were using our prison system like a county jail, right? And so this reform led to this drop. And just to show you precisely what's going on, these are different measures of recidivism for different cohorts of inmates being released from the Department of Corrections in California. And each month here is being measured relative to when realignment goes into effect. And what we're doing is we're looking at people that have left prison, we're following them for 12 months and calculating whether or not they're rearrested or they're reconvicted or they're returned to custody. And what you can see is that this is the return to custody rate, the purple one. And once you get beyond this line here, you're within the range where your 12-month period will cross over into realignment at some point. You see the return to prison rate for people being released from prison dropping from 40% basically down to 9%, right? So it was a quite drastic reform, and pretty much most of it was operating through how we were treating parolees. So that's what happened with California Realignment. That's 2011. Now, Prop 47, on the other hand, that's a more recent reform. Again, this was not forced by the court. It didn't come from the California legislature. This was passed by the voters of California, passed by 60% actually, which tells you something, that a state which ushered in 3 strikes and passed a lot of things by initiative that were making sort of life tougher on people who are committing felony offenses have been receding through popular initiatives. So there's been a change in politics. So what did Prop 47 do? This was passed in November of 2014, and basically what it did is it took a bunch of crimes that are known as wobblers, which means, I don't know if they have that term here. Do they use the term wobblers? No, that's an American thing. So wobblers means, you know, someone gets caught stealing $1,000 or $850, or they have a certain amount of crack cocaine or a certain amount of drugs, and you can charge them either as a felony or as a misdemeanor, right? And a felony, you know, if you're convicted, that's sort of a necessary condition for going to prison. If it's a misdemeanor, you can get probation, you get county jail. So it's much more serious to be charged as a felony. So what the voters did is they passed this proposition that basically took a series of drug offenses, not all drug offenses, but a range of them, and then also a series of theft offenses, those that have a value of the merchandise less than $950, and changed them all from wobblers to misdemeanors, right? And that led to almost an immediate reduction in the pretrial population, and then also an immediate reduction in the prison population. Now here, this was interesting because it seems that the operating or the sort of causal channel in terms of the impact on prison jail seems to actually be driven by the way the police have enforced this particular law. So this graph is showing this is monthly arrests relative to November 2014 when Prop 47 goes into effect. And these are felony drug arrests and these are misdemeanor drug arrests. And if there was no change in the levels, what we would expect to see is misdemeanor drug arrests, there'll be an increase completely offsetting the decrease in felony, and there is an increase in misdemeanor drug arrests, but it's less than the total decline. So when we look at all drug arrests decline, there's actually a decline in drug arrests over this time period. And you see it more precisely when we look at property crime arrests, right? So here's our felony property crime arrest before and after the reform. Here's our misdemeanor property crime arrests. And it really looks like there was a decline in police enforcement, right? That they just essentially were not arresting people for certain types of crimes in response to this proposition. And this is something that, there's sort of an active amount of research trying to understand what the impact of this is. And it's a relatively open topic and open for researchers to investigate. If people in New South Wales want to do research on California, I can help you get the data. Okay, so what have been the effects of these two big pieces of legislation? So realignment, basically it caused a large decline in the prison population, okay? However, since it mandated that people who are on parole or now what we call post-release community supervision must be violated to a county jail sentence, it was partially offset by an increase in the number of people in our county jails, right? And so that has created some issues. Prop 47, on the other hand, given that it's led to this decline in arrest activity, has led to both declines in the prison and jail populations. And for the most part, as we'll see, it's basically reduced 20 years of incarceration growth in the state to the point where now our incarceration rate is basically where it was at around 1990, right before we even passed three strikes law. So it's been quite dramatic. So this graph right here, these are all measured in week relative to October 5th, 2011. The first red line is basically when realignment goes into effect and we get this new thing called triple nons. The second red line is when we pass Prop 47. And then these blue dots here are the weekly prison population as of midnight on Wednesday, right? The Department of Corrections list. So you can kind of see that our prison population drops quite steadily, right? So we're at about 160,000. Here's where we're trying to incentivize people, our probation departments, to not send people back. And then there are a few other things that happen here. The Department of Corrections explores a sort of program called non-revocable parole. It didn't really have that much impact, but there's some decline in the population. Then realignment comes and bam, right? There's a big exogenous shock. And then Prop 47 passes, and that sort of brings us even lower. In fact, it was interesting that much of the discussion in California focuses around the federal court order to get below 137.5%. And realignment almost got us there, but not quite there. But then Prop 47 came in and sort of finished the job. So now it's the case that the state population is way lower, and we have much less overcrowding than we did even just a few years ago. What happens to the county jail population? Okay, so just the scale here. So here we're at 160, 170,000 people, right? And then it drops down to 128. In terms of the jail population, before realignment, we had 75, 85,000. Big declines here being driven in part by the fact that many of the counties are under their own court orders to reduce incarceration. It's really amazing how decentralized the United States is. So you have 3,000 different county jail systems, and they're all subject to the same litigious forces and also environmental forces in terms of crime and control as our state prison systems. But here's what happens to the county jails. These are the trends before. Realignment goes into effect, and now we have triple nons and parole violators that are now doing short stints in county jail. And then Prop 47 goes into effect, where we redefine wobblers, and basically it brings us down, right? So both things had fairly large impacts on our correction. And then these are the two combined, right? So over this period, we're going from 250,000 inmates down to about 230 right before all the reform starts. Then we're down to roughly 217, and then we're down at about 200,000, right? So in a relatively short period of time, we reduced our incarcerated population by 200, or by roughly a quarter, right? So it's a pretty big decline. I think in the U.S., at least to my knowledge, and I've spent an enormous amount of time looking at state-level incarceration trends over the last 10 years. There's no example of an exogenous shock this big anywhere. Okay, and then this is how. So basically, California explains this moderation right there, and then you can see that's just the story of what tells that decline, or what drives that decline. Okay, now of course I've just been reading in the papers and also talking to Don about the inequality in the incidence of incarceration in Australia. We also have a very similar situation in the U.S. Our sort of largest minority, perhaps that's most impacted by incarceration rate, are African Americans. And it is interesting to think through, well, what are the impacts of these reforms in terms of the distributional consequences? So what I've done here is just calculated from our census the proportion of sort of prime age males 18 to 65 that are institutionalized on any given day in 2007, 2010, and 2015 for African American males, Hispanic males, other males, and white males. Hispanic is not considered a race in the United States, it's ethnicity, but it's pretty much anyone who self-identifies as having family from Central or South America, and oftentimes the Caribbean as well. And then this is for non-California males. And what you can basically see is there are enormous racial disparities, right, in correctional supervision, where pre-realignment you had on any given day 10% of African American males incarcerated, and 1.6% of non-Hispanic white males, and it narrows some, right, down to 7.4%, and there's a slight impact here, but there's still enormous differentials. And we don't see a comparable decline among non-California males, quite naturally, because there was no change in the other states that was comparable in magnitude to what happened in California. And then for California females, less so. Okay, although generally speaking, the female incarceration rate, men were out of control, is much lower than the male incarceration rate, so you didn't see a disproportionate impact. And one other thing on distributional consequences, this is just showing as we noted for Prop 47, a lot of what was going on in Prop 47 was, that there was a decline in enforcement that seemed to be driven on the arrest end, so at the very front end of the admissions process into the criminal justice system. So one interesting question to ask is, how has the number of arrests per 100,000 changed in the 12 months prior to the 12 months after? And I'm looking at all arrests, and then these are called booked arrests because that means that you're actually dragged down fingerprinted, and it's arrests in the United States include both custodial and non-custodial arrests. But what we can see is that in absolute terms, there's a larger decline for African Americans who are arrested at a much higher rate than for non-Hispanic whites and for Hispanics, okay, in California. So it does appear that these reforms have narrowed some of the racial disparities some, but most of the disparities still exist, okay? All right, so what's been the impact on public safety, okay? So, you know, of course, there are lots of avenues or several avenues that we can think about that might result in an impact of these changes on crime rates. Perhaps the most obvious is that you know, if you incarcerate someone who's criminally active, you're going to incapacitate them, and to the extent that that incapacitation results in less street time and less offending, we might expect to see an impact on crime rates. There's also, at least, you know, I'm an economist by training. Economists like to think about incentives, so I can't give a talk without mentioning general deterrence. But there are many who argue that the tougher the sentence is, that will deter people from committing crime. I do believe that deterrent effects exist, though I generally think that when you make a long prison sentence longer, that for somebody who's very present-oriented and maybe high when they're doing what they're doing, it probably doesn't have much an impact on their decision-making. But we can talk about that during the Q&A if people disagree. You know, a third avenue is simply, you know, people are incarcerated, they can be rehabilitated, they may become deterred by the experience of incarceration that they don't want to go back, or it could be that being in prison is a great place to learn new things, right? And perhaps how to be a better criminal, how to you know, sort of survive in a very harsh environment. And it might actually have a criminogenic effect, right? So clearly there's no clear reason why that effect has to be one way or the other or in one direction, and it could be heterogeneous across the population. So, you know, we have no prior about what the impacts would be. Now, another thing that I've done an enormous amount, or I spend an enormous amount of time thinking about, is whether or not there's declining returns to scale, okay? And the basic idea here is that if we apply prison more liberally, and I don't mean liberal like Democrat liberal, you know, I don't know what the equivalent is in Australia, but I mean liberal like as in sending more people to prison. You know, we're going to catch people who are less dangerous, okay? And at the same time, if we apply prison more intensively, that means we incarcerate people into advanced age, and one of the perhaps strongest empirical regularities in criminality is that people's propensity to offend declines quite rapidly with age. And so we would expect, given the reforms in the U.S., as we've increased our prison incarceration rate, that perhaps on the margin, you know, that marginal prison year served is perhaps preventing less crime than say, it was in the 1970s or so. And these are things that we're going to explore. So what happens in California? I'm going to walk through a little bit of the research that I've done with my colleague Magnus Lofstrom at PPIC on California. But before we get into the specifics, I just want to bracket what to expect. Okay, so here's the violent crime rate overall for California. And violent crimes are, you know, we aggregate homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and that's what we in the U.S. call our set of violent crimes. It's usually when there's some sort of crime that involves contact, physical contact with a victim, and it's just expressed per 100,000. So in 1980, you know, we're here at about 900 incidents per 100,000. There's a run-up, and this is kind of the peak of crime in California and the peak of crime in the United States in the early 1990s. And then something extraordinary happens, and no one really knows what the effector is. It's kind of the holy grail of crime research in the U.S. is to understand what's going on here. But crime drops quite drastically, right? And this red line is basically the last realignment year, right? So we know the prison population was at its peak around here, and then by this last 2015 year, our prison population has dropped a lot. And basically this red line here is basically the last year our incarceration rate was at the level it was here, right? So basically we kind of hit rewind and went back to 1990, but our crime rate is kind of where it is here, right? So we did not end up with a crime rate where in 1990. So the idea, you know, we undid all of this particular intervention, and, you know, while there's some zigging zagging, and from 14 to 15 there looks like there's an increase, we don't have essentially the crime rate associated with the last time we were incarcerating people at that level. So we know that the impact, generally speaking, has been limited. And you can do a similar story with property crime, right? So property crime was trending down rather than increasing during the 80s. There was enormous declines during the 90s and 2000s, and then we hit the rewind button, reduced incarceration back to this year, but we still have relatively modest crime. So as a general principle, you know, it looks like not much happened. Okay, but that being said, of course, we need to look at it in some greater detail. So how might one do this? So we've actually spent a lot of time studying realignment, and we've tried to tease out the effect of this reduction in the incarceration on the crime rate using several different methodological approaches. This is showing the result of something called a synthetic cohort analysis, and basically what it does is it looks during the let's say that this is the last pre-realignment year. These are all pre-realignment years, say for 10 years. What we did is we used a computer algorithm to look at the other 49 states other than California and to come up with an average, you know, the average of some set of the states that best approximates California during the pre-intervention period, during this period. And essentially what that does is it creates what we call a synthetic California, right? That you take the average of a few states and it seems to chart the state in the pre-period quite well. And then what you do is you sort of look forward. Okay, so we do that matching in the pre-period and then we compare, well, what happened in real California relative to synthetic California? And if the crime trends depart, you can attribute that to the policy intervention. So it's a non-experimental causal inference technique that economists have started to use quite a bit in recent years. And what do we see? So the synthetic California is basically the orange line, real California is the blue line, and this is for the violent crime rate. And what we see is that, you know, despite all of that movement and a fairly large decline in incarceration associated with realignment, there was absolutely no effect on violent crime, right? So we couldn't find any evidence of an impact. If we do the same thing with property crime, again, synthetic California and real California chart one another, and then there does appear to be a small impact on property crime, which seems to be operating entirely through motor vehicle theft. And when you price it out in terms of the cost of crime and compare it to the cost of a year in prison, it suggests that the return per dollar spent on incarceration for California, this is actually quite low, way below $1, right? There are other ways to do this, so this is just one way, which is the synthetic cohort method. The other way, and I thought this graph is going to blow your mind, right? So get ready, okay? So what this is doing, so California has 58 counties, right? And the counties differ enormously, right, in their approaches to criminal justice and the way they do things. So we have San Francisco, okay, which has an incarceration rate of 200 per 100,000 in terms of, you know, the rate at which San Francisco residents are in the state prison system. And then we have counties in the Central Valley that have incarceration rates of 1,200 per 100,000, right? And you can't explain those differences by differences in crime rates. They're basically differences in the way the prosecutors and judges in those counties are implementing the same state law, right? That some places are just tough and they like to use prisons, and some places don't. So one of the things we did is we took those counties and we kind of compared year before year. You know, we took these year-over-year changes for different months surrounding the impact of realignment, and just created scatter plots of those changes in crime rates against changes in the incarceration rates experienced by each county. Okay. And so here's the thing that's kind of amazing, like, is when you plot out so this is change in incarceration rate month before, month after for these counties and for different months surrounding realignment. There are some counties where the decline in the incarceration rate caused by realignment was almost at 200 per 100,000. Okay, so that would be like eliminating the prison population in Australia. Okay, now of course that's coming from a base of 1,200 per 100,000, so they had a lot of room to go. Right, but it just gives you a sense of the difference in scale of how some counties are using prison population. And what you can basically see is when you look at the change in incarceration rate against change in crime violence, just a flat line, right? So there's not much of an impact. and then there's a slight negative slope for property crime, and that results in basically these point estimates, right? So this is like the effect of 1 prison year served on total violent and the individual violent crimes. You have very tightly estimated zeros, and then total property, nothing really on burglary, nothing really on larceny, but on motor vehicle theft, that's the only place where you kind of see an impact. And the estimate seems to be that on average you have about 1.2 thefts per prison year not served. And the truth is that motor vehicle theft is actually kind of a highly specialized crime, right? Because you have to be able to chop the car, you got to fence the car, you got to know steal the car. So it probably means that a subset of the people who are realigned are sort of particularly active, right? So in terms of the crime effects for realignment, there's actually surprisingly very little impact, right? That we had a fairly large reduction in incarceration, and we had just a modest impact on property theft. Now, Prop 47 is sort of an open question, and there has not been a lot of research on this to date as of yet. Partly in response, this is partly due to the fact that crime statistics in the United States come out with a relatively long lag. So, despite the fact that it is now 2017, we will not see 2016 crime numbers until June of this year, right? So it takes a long time for everything to be compiled by the FBI and released. But we can at least look for 2014-15 changes and ask where California was relative to other states in the country. And basically what we see is that, at least if we look at the distribution of changes for violent crime, California had the 10th highest increase from 14 to 15. From property crime, California was in the upper tail, right? The second highest increase, right? So it might be the case that Prop 47 may have had an impact. That being said, I know that that's bad for your eyes, but that being said, it's still the case that this is the increase we're talking about, right? So if we look at the last pre-intervention year, we're kind of still on line with where we were, right? And so for the most part, the impacts of these reforms on crime have been relatively modest, right? And it's kind of a fascinating change and a fascinating development. Okay, so what explains this, right? Why do we have relatively small effects? I used to really think that this was all diminishing returns. I think it might also be perhaps, or another theory that is entirely consistent with this, and I'm going to talk about this one first because now I'm going to try to convince you after that it's all diminishing returns, is that perhaps the offending propensity has changed, right? That I don't know, the kids are just smarter today, right, for whatever reason, or they're drinking less, or they're playing video games, or what have you, right? There are lots of theories that explain why younger people today, or at least the cohort that was, more recent cohorts are offending at lower rates around the world. The two contending, or there's more than two, but there's several contending explanations in the U.S. That are suggestive, yet do not really have a large empirical basis behind them. One is that children are literally smarter than their adults because there's less lead contamination associated with later birth cohorts relative to older birth cohorts. And the basic idea was the passage of, I think, the Clean Air Act, 1970s, took lead out of gasoline. And so that means that, my daughter's IQ is just discreetly higher than mine because I ate a lot of lead dirt when I was a kid, right? And I don't know, it's probably true. So that's one possibility. So it might be that we're releasing people in an era when people are just less criminally prone. There's the more sort of controversial hypothesis by John Donahue and Steve Levitt that have argued that the legalization of abortion in the late 1970s led to a delayed impact on crime. And the argument that they make is that abortion has selectively prevented the births of people who would otherwise be higher level offenders. And there's a lot of debate around that. There have been, I don't think that there's conclusive evidence of that being the case, but it's one of the theories that are out there. And then I think there are other interesting issues, like the fact that we don't have as much money in circulation, people don't carry cash, it's not so lucrative to rob people, and then video games, and there are all these other things that researchers are working on. But it could simply be that, we're lowering the incarceration rate in a time period when people are just less likely to offend. On the other hand, I do think that there's evidence in other countries and also in the U.S. that suggests that that there are diminishing marginal returns. So I can walk you through just a few different things, right? So I did some work on a large Italian prison release with an Italian co-author a few years back. The Italians have a long history of these collective clemencies where they will literally sort of release a large number of inmates, say people who have less than 3 years to serve on their sentence. And in fact, it happened so frequently that they actually passed a law in the 1990s that made it a requirement to have a supermajority to have one of those things happen. Well, anyway, there wasn't one for a long time. In 2006, a collective clemency bill was passed that reduced the sentence of inmates, most of the inmates, frankly, that by 3 years. So anybody who had 3 years left to serve on their time was basically released from prison, and then they were subject to the sort of restriction that if they were convicted again, their remaining time was added on. So basically, what happened? So here's a prison population in Italy. They have a relatively low incarceration rate, both pre-trial and post. It drops, and then it goes back up over time because sentencing reform didn't really change anything. They just borrowed tomorrow's releases and used them for today. And what happened to crime? Well, in Italy, you saw a big increase in crime, right, associated with that decline. Most of this was associated with theft, right, when you actually looked at the violent felonies. However, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. What we saw in our study was that when we compared the provinces that had low incarceration rates, the crime effects, to the provinces that had high incarceration rates, and I'll say exactly what that means, the impact of a year not served on crime was much lower in the low incarceration rate provinces. So the places that used it sparingly, 1 additional year prevented 36 offenses. In the area that used it more liberally, it only prevented 4. And in fact, we can kind of sketch out what that relationship looks like. So these are Italian provinces at the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, 90th percentile of the incarceration rate distribution. So here's this would be their version of the liberal San Francisco, and here's Kings County, right? But here's the incarceration rate, and this is from 32.5 per 100 to 191. Here's Australia, right? And you can see that even just moving and then this is the crime effect, the orange, right? That you have diminishing returns setting in these Italian provinces at very low levels, right? At levels that are below Australia's level, right? And definitely below the United States level. So, for us, California is like way over here somewhere, right? And here we're having very, very small impacts on crime. We brought our incarceration rate down from 660 per 100,000 to in the 500 per 100,000. We don't see much of an effect, and that would be consistent with diminishing marginal returns, right? There are other things there are other pieces of evidence from other countries that suggest that this might be true. So, for example, there's a great paper by Ben Villard, a Dutch economist, who looked at a sentence enhancement in 2001 that was targeted at offenders that had 10 or more prior felony offenses. And basically what they did is if you were caught for your 11th offense, rather than getting a couple months detention, you got 2 years detention, okay? Basically, the interesting thing about this was that the localities or the municipalities in Holland were limited as to how many slots they could use, and it was administratively determined how many sentence enhancements they can give out. And it turned out that some were granted enough that they can dip really far into their usual offender pools, and some were granted only a few where they couldn't dip too far into their usual offender pools. And Ben was able to get the criminal histories of people who were arrested many times who would be eligible for these sentence enhancements, and let's look at the places that dipped really far into the offender pool and compare the criminal histories of those guys to the places that weren't allowed. And that's essentially this next graph. So he fashioned something called an incapacitation ratio, which is the proportion of the offender pool of the frequent flyers that they could dip into given their allotment. And then he looked at the annual number of offenses on the person's offense history, and you found that the places that were relatively constrained were netting more dangerous people relative to the places that were less constrained. So even among a highly active group of criminal offenders, he's finding evidence that there's diminishing marginal returns, right? And all of this suggests that at least using incarceration as a tool, that there's a lot of room for kind of tailoring this, right, for strategic incapacitation for people who really seem to be incorrigible. And even among people with 10 prior felony offenses, in Holland, a lot of this were, people who have heroin addiction, that there appeared to be heterogeneity in propensity to offend. Just one other result. So my colleague Michael Stoll and I, we spent a lot of time just using state-level panel regressions with an identification strategy that would be really boring to get into. But what we did is we tried to estimate essentially how a 1-year change in incarceration or a one-person change, an additional prison year served would impact the number of Part 1 felony offenses in the United States at different points in time. So, for example, during the 70s to 88, when the average incarceration rate was 171, from 89 to 99 when it was 349, and then this most recent time period, and then we used our methods to try to estimate how many crimes were prevented per prison year served, and we found, basically that during the 70s it seemed to be relatively large, and in more recent years it was relatively small. And we actually wrote this before California, and what was kind of fascinating was our 1.2 auto thefts was basically right in line with what we saw, right? So yeah, it might be the case the kids are smarter, but I think part of what's just going on is that like any tool, right? If we think of crime, if there's a crime prevention, if our objective is to minimize crime, we have all these tools we're going to use, just always using incarceration is like never changing your dance move. You got to vary it sometime. Like the other one might have a bigger bang per buck. And we've used incarceration a lot in the United States, right? And it's one of the reasons I'm very excited that we're going to have a presentation tomorrow from the Washington State Institute of Public Policy, because the whole sort of economic approach to policy analysis is to compare the relative effectiveness of different interventions and to try to find a mix of tools that sort of achieve your objective but at lowest social cost, right? Okay, so that's all I wanted to say, and I wanted to leave time for questions. Is that okay? I have 3 seconds to spare.
Any questions? There must be questions. Oh, I'm going to break the ice for them after your phone stops.
Pause. Okay.
So one of the questions that was on my mind while you were talking is that we talk about the potential diminishing marginal returns, and that's consistent with what Blumstein said about sort of stretching the bounds of the prison population into less and less productive offenders, less and less active offenders. But another thing we don't talk too much about is the effect of different release policies at different times. So, for example, releasing 1,000 prisoners during the middle of a heroin epidemic might have very different, especially if there's a bad job market. So you get out of prison, the marginal return on drug dealing is really good, chance of getting a job is really bad, whereas releasing the same 1,000 prisoners now with a reasonably active economy and no heroin problem. Has there been any work done on the impact of environment, employment, market outcomes on the response to imprisonment?
There have been several studies about releasing, about the effect of economic conditions at release on return to custody. Anyway, I can't names, but and they tend to show that there is an impact, right? And that the impact seems to be largest for people who are on their first release. So somebody who has done many terms is on their third or fourth prison. They tend to have, to be less responsive on the margin to incentives. But there does appear to be an impact of release conditions. I think there are also perhaps a kind of more subtle issue seems to be whether or not the conditions of release or actually the releasing authority can impact outcomes. So for example, in the U.S. we have a difference between discretionary parole and mandatory parole. And mandatory parole is they have a very formulaic, you earn these time credits, you don't, and then you're going to be released. And it doesn't really create any incentive for people to program, for people to demonstrate remorse, for people to demonstrate that they're ready to leave. And it also takes the control away from the parole authorities to not release somebody who they think is not ready to be released. And there appears to be evidence that parole officers or parole boards tend to use the information that they have that we don't have, right? So they could use disciplinary history, they could use interview history, and so on and so forth. And they use it efficiently in the sense that if someone doesn't need to be there, they can identify that on average, right? And they can improve outcomes of release. So yes, clearly reentry planning matters, conditions matter. A big issue in the States as well is continuum of care when it comes to mental health care. So, we've had, for the last few years, an expansion of Medicaid in many states that has actually made mental health care available to people as they release. Now, it's in question whether that's going to survive because that was part of Obamacare. But it's definitely the case that the environments that people are going to be released into is going to impact the likelihood they come back.
Yep, Rick. I'll just give you the mic. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that. First, a quick observation. I'm glad we've got county jails, because if you didn't have county jails, you wouldn't have half the country and western songs we have at the moment. Second question, though, following on from Don's question, you're talking very much about the diminishing marginal returns, very much in the short term. What about the long term? And I'm thinking now of 10 or 15 years from now, the relationships that broke up during those massive periods of incarceration, the unemployability of a massive cohort of Americans who are now going to find it very difficult to have a lifetime of employment, the effect on those children having dads and increasingly mums behind bars for a lengthy period of time. Everything you've said so far has to do with the short term. What about the long term? If it's a blunt instrument in the short term, I would have thought it's an even blunter instrument in the long term.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a large body of research in the U.S. that sometimes falls under the title of the collateral consequences studies, right? And it studies everything from what's the impact of removing an adult from the household on children, what's the impact on marital stability, what's the impact on the quality of matches in communities that have really high male incarceration rates, to what's been the impact on the spread of AIDS among African Americans. And then, of course, there's the employment consequences, right? So, that huge increase in the prison admission rate for drugs leaves in its wake a huge population of former prisoners that, for the rest of their life, have to indicate that they have a criminal degree and have done time. And the stigma associated with that in the United States is very big, right? And it's very difficult and thorny and hard to undo. I tend, in my mind, not to think so much of long-term, but more steady state. Because a lot of times the people who are going in and out of prison, at least in our country, it's not a matter of, we sent people away in the 80s and now they're all come back, we have to do it. Half the prison population releases each year. So it's more like we have a lot of churning through this institution, and what is associated with that is sort of a large growth in the proportion of people who now declare themselves former inmates and everything. And the social costs associated with that are very large, right? I work with a lot of students at UC Berkeley who are, we have a group of students, the underground scholars, many of whom have done time. And this is something that even as they'll go get degrees and they still encounter stigma. And it's something that impacts the life of many, impacts the family, impacts racial inequality, impacts politics, and it's definitely costly. So in some ways what I did here was relatively narrow, right? We just looked at the short-term effects on crime without looking at sort of the cost side of the ledger. And in general, a lot of times public policy discussions seem to focus on, crime and how much it costs to incarcerate. But the costs to be complete, we have to have a broader conceptualization of social impacts of these institutions.
Anybody else got a question? After that, yeah.
You mentioned Steve Levitt's sort of controversial theory on almost the legalization of abortion sort of acting as like, I guess, like a selection effect. I was wondering could you talk a bit about that? What kind of evidence is there? I found that kind of interesting.
Well, so there were a few states that had legalized abortion a little bit earlier, before Roe v. Wade, which was the Supreme Court decision that made it legal across the land. And so most of that evidence basically shows that there was a somewhat quicker decline or earlier decline in the two states, I can't remember which ones they were, in crime rates that legalized earlier. And so the idea being that, well, it was selectively available in these particular states and therefore you're going to have a quicker decline. That's sort of the experiment. And then the debate, sort of to get kind of technical, is between Levitt and Donahue and a few other researchers that are kind of fighting over the specification of a particular panel regression, whether particular interactive fixed effect makes the effect go away or not. So the result, I mean, there is a suggestive result there, but it appears to be somewhat sensitive to the model that's used to estimate it. So that's why it's offered, it's thrown out there. I think that more people are excited by the lead paint, or not the lead paint and the lead gasoline story these days. And I think in part because it's, one interesting thing about any country, right, when we focus on what's happening in our nation, or me, I'm worried about California, when you look outside, you see sort of the same trends elsewhere, right? So like crime's declining here too, right? Crime is declining in Europe. Sometimes the peaks are in different places. And so you wonder, well, what is the common factor among all of these countries that might be explaining this pattern? And there appears to have been sort of removing lead from gasoline was something that didn't only happen in the US, happened in other countries. And there's also quite a bit of suggestive and actually some pretty good research now that seems to show sort of lower cognitive outcomes, poorer schooling, more behavioral problems among kids that are identified earlier on via a lead surveillance system to have been lead poisoned or to have dangerously high levels of lead in their blood. So that that's one of the reasons. That's the cohort story that is one that's receiving a lot of attention.
Got time for one more. I know you're all desperate for coffee up the back there.
I'm interested in the ban the box movement about with enormous employers like Walmart no longer asking on the application form whether you've had a prior conviction. Do you see that as something that can actually have an impact on employability and the long-term impacts that Rick was talking about, or do you see it more as a sort of cynical political movement?
No, I don't think it's a cynical political movement, but I wanted to actually get into this, and I'm glad you asked that question, in response to Rick's question. And there's a complicating factor associated with ban the box. And this is a very US thing, right? And that is that there's some research, some that I've done, and actually a couple of recent papers as well, that have done it a lot better, frankly. That seem to show that when you ban the box, right, so you say you can't check, that employers come to any interaction with an applicant with a prior, right, that they're going, if they care about the criminal history of the individual, they're going to try to figure out whether the person has criminal history. And in the US, given these huge racial disparities, right, there seems to be evidence that employers will sort of systematically discriminate against black men, right, when they can't check. Okay, not all employers, but on average, you see the callback rates drop, okay, for black male applicants when the information is not readily available. And so it creates this odd trade-off there where you could make the information available. It means it's going to harm people who have criminal histories among, say, the black male population, but it might benefit people among the black male population who don't, because they can credibly speak to a preconception, wrongly or not, that the employer holds, and it can undo that. But the ban the box movement is actually, it's quite sincere. The people who are pushing for it are oftentimes, inmate advocates, are sort of people who are interested in social justice, and but there's concern that it may come at the expense, oftentimes, of people who are from groups that have high incarceration rates, yet don't have criminal history records, right? So it's a complex topic that is actually now kind of, that issue has come to the forefront in policy circles in the United States.
Well, I think it's time for coffee. Would you all join me in thanking Steve?
Thank you.
We have something quite special here. This is made by Aboriginal inmates at our state jail. So you'll never forget this. No, I won't.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Don. That's
Pleasure.
wonderful. Thank you.